Former LBC host Sangita Myska has finally spoken out about how she was forced out of LBC. Well, kind of. In a statement, Myska says this: "I wish to make it clear that there are extremely onerous and lasting contractual restrictions that prevent me from discussing the circumstances surrounding my departure. These restrictions were integral to my original presenter agreement. The terms are not just restrictive, they remain in place indefinitely. I am not permitted to explain what happened before or after I left. I would have expected anyone associated with LBC to realise that." Now, that last line is a reference to her former colleague, LBC host James O'Brien. Back in March, he was tackled on air by a listener when this happened.
What happened to Sangita, even at LBC?
No, that's just Rolex, mate. And I mean, you can say it because you've got free speech, but that's just crap.
Thank you.
All right. We all sit in. I'll tell you something, because it bores me rigid. This, and I can't believe that certain people have allowed this lie to be perpetuated. We sit in a room every 3 months. Every single person that works here, we sit in a room every 3 months. They show us graphs of how our program is performing. Right? Everybody knows when someone's vulnerable. And it's not the graph of what audience you inherit when you come on air. It's a graph of how your audience falls or rises during the duration of your program. Every single person in this building sits in that room and watches a graph for every single program every 3 months. All right?
I don't want to get off topic.
No, you said it. You can't backtrack now, mate. You have decided you have decided to believe something that isn't true, and the only person that can prove to you that it isn't true has decided to stay silent and allow people like you to believe slurs and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about her former colleagues. So
I didn't make an anti-Semitic slur or anything.
Yes, you are. You're claiming that someone has been censored or silenced when they haven't.
But that's not anti-Semitic. How's that anti-Semitic? That in itself is what's wrong with everything.
Okay, mate. I am setting the record straight on something, okay? And the idea that somebody would be silenced for being critical of Israel during a phone-in that is heavily critical of Israel is palpably absurd. You can dispute the fact that it's anti-Semitic. That's my opinion. And that is my freedom of speech that I am exercising, just as you are exercising yours. But if you choose to come on this program and tell lies about every single one of my colleagues, I will push back, okay? And that is what you are doing. I sympathize with you because the lies have been deliberately allowed to fester by somebody who can only answer for their own conduct. But it is lies.
So that was a pretty wild statement from James O'Brien there. So someone suggesting that Sangita Myska lost her job after discussing Israel. He says that's a anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Now, we know lots of people who definitely have lost their job after speaking out against Israel. Mehdi Hassan, one of them, lost his job from MSNBC. Brianna Joy Gray from The Hill. So this is something which often happens, right? It's not an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory to say that someone has lost their job for speaking out against Israel. This is just a fact. It happens. Right? Now, any time someone suggests that's what's happened, it might not always be the case that when there's a suspicion that that's what's really gone on, but it's definitely not anti-Semitic to, infer in situations that is what has happened. I suppose James O'Brien, they're also sort of saying there's a big problem that Sangita Myska hasn't put these people to right. But Sangita Myska sort of confirming what I think lots of people would have suspected, and one imagines that James O'Brien would have known, which is that she is under a non-disclosure agreement. Myska also addressed how, in her view, O'Brien had weaponized her silence against her, saying this: "It has been suggested, including by James O'Brien on his LBC show, that by remaining silent, I deliberately allowed anti-Semitic conspiracy theories surrounding my departure to develop and chose not to correct them. That accusation is false. It is deeply upsetting, and it goes against everything I stand for as a journalist and as a human being. I have and will always fight against racism and bigotry, including anti-Semitism. These false claims are especially damaging because I cannot respond to them in full. It is unjust for LBC or its associates to speculate publicly about the reasons for my departure while I remain legally silenced." Myska, of course, isn't saying exactly why she was given the boot. I suppose she's suggesting that she's contractually not able to do that. She has, though, stated that to her mind, it definitely wasn't her ratings, which was the insinuation from James O'Brien there. So in her statement, she goes on to say, "What I can say is this: I left LBC last year. I was not informed in advance that my time at the station was ending prematurely. I was not allowed to say goodbye to my listeners. My final 16 weekend shows were pulled from the schedule without my knowledge, discussion, or agreement. I remain incredibly proud of what we, the callers, contributors, and team who worked on the show, achieved together during my tenure. We reached record average audiences in excess of 500,000 listeners a week in 2 separate quarters, verified by RAJAR, the official and impartial body for measuring UK radio audiences." So she says her audiences were good, as you can see by RAJAR. I mean, she had also been working there for 2 years, and then they just sort of took her off air without any warning while she still had weeks left in her contract, which to me doesn't seem like it was simply because she wasn't getting high enough ratings. Now, of course, we can't say either way why Myska was axed by LBC. But what we can do is show you what happened live on air just days before she disappeared from the airwaves. So this interview took place in the context of Iran launching a retaliatory airstrike on Israel last April. Israeli spokesperson Avi Hyman appeared on Myska's show when this happened.
What Israel did by taking that action against Iran was escalate what is already an incredibly fragile situation. Didn't it?
Sangita, that's an outrageous framing of the reality.
It's not an outrageous framing. I've just been speaking to somebody who is a diplomat to Iran from the UK government. That's not an outrageous framing of it. What Israel did was strike what is considered in diplomatic circles the sovereign territory of Iran, whether we like it or not. No. And there was undoubtedly going to be a blowback. So did Israel game out what was going to happen next?
Firstly, I'm not going to speak directly to that strike. What I can say definitively, and this is why it's outrageous, I can say definitively is that wasn't an embassy, it wasn't a consulate, it wasn't any type of diplomatic mission.
It's been widely reported as that.
Because that's what Iran says. Because that's what Iran says. So would you like to copy and paste?
Are you suggesting every single news organization in the world has got that wrong?
So you make up your own mind. You've been working there for 2 years, suddenly taken off air with 16 weeks left of her contract. Was it, as James O'Brien says, because her ratings weren't good enough? She says the publicly available rating shows she was doing quite well. Or was it because she was outspoken when it came to Israel? Let's also show you something that Sangita Myska posted on Instagram before she published the statement, which we read to you at the start of this segment. It's by the Scottish poet Charles Mackay, and he says, you have no enemies, you say. Alas, my friend, the boast is poor. He who has mingled in the fray of duty, that the brave endure, must have foes. If you have none, small is the work that you have done. You've hit no traitor on the hip, you've dashed no cup from perjured lip. You've never turned the wrong to right. You've been a coward in the fight. Helena, what do you make of this? I mean, I suppose it was an attempted dressing down, wasn't it, from James O'Brien of his audience member, suggesting that the audience member was being anti-Semitic, which, to be honest, the person who'd called into James O'Brien very sort of, I think, effectively rebutted. But what do you make of this row?
I mean, the first insinuation there that somehow it is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory to say that someone would be removed from their post as a journalist for being too critical of Israel. Well, first of all, that is trying to make some kind of connection between the international Jewish community and Israel itself, which is, of course, kind of pernicious. And I would call that an anti-Semitic kind of trope to try and draw these things as being equivalent, right? You can always be critical of the meddling of Israeli operatives and of Israeli lobbyists within huge parts of foreign countries and foreign governments, and of course within foreign media. This has been widely reported on from places like the Classified UK. We had a former IDF general, Aviv Kohavi, going around media institutions lobbying for the Israeli government narrative during this conflict, right, with places like the FT and the Guardian and the BBC and indeed Sky News and the Foreign Secretary himself. So we've already had people speaking to other media organizations on behalf of the Israeli government to try and ensure that they get some kind of pro-Israeli coverage, to try and foment the kind of Hasbara narrative in terms of the way in which that they report the conflict in Gaza, right? So that's already been something that's happened. Now, I'm not saying that's happened in LBC. I've not seen reporting that's shown that specifically happened. But to even make that insinuation, given what we know has happened in other media organizations, is not anti-Semitic or a conspiracy theory in the slightest, right? That is just an appraisal of our media broadly, of the relationship our media broadly has with the Israeli security state, and has been for a very, very long time, and especially given the ramping up of the scrutiny of Israel since the start of the recent bout of conflict in Gaza that started on October the 7th, right? That isn't anti-Semitic conspiracy theory at all to suggest such a thing. So James O'Brien is just kind of flat wrong in that case. Maybe people jumped the gun, like immediately saying that there was case closed on the idea that she was definitely removed because of her the spat that she had with Avi Hyman that we played you just then. But it does seem a little bit strange. If you're going to have some kind of performance review, which would take you off the air because of poor ratings and poor figures, you'd expect that to have happened at the end of a contract with a broad and full appraisal of what your figures were like over that period, regardless of whether you think that the figures that she did have were enough that she should have kept her show on air. Like, people have been comparing her to a replacement, which is Vanessa Feltz, but they're in different time slots. Is it the same over the course of the whole program? And does that correspond to similar amounts of viewers that would be had in that slot as it is right now? I don't know. I've not seen LBC's overall internal figures to be able to give you a full appraisal of that. But you'd expect some kind of performance review related sacking, essentially, would have been done at the end of a contract period once you had all that information. The fact that it was done so immediately, where, actual kind of penciled in dates where she would be presenting LBC had been scrubbed off the record completely overnight, with no ability to be able to say goodbye to her audience, and indeed it all happening directly after that incident, it does stand at least somewhat that it may make sense on a kind of intuitive perspective that would be the case. I can't see any other possible explanation. And then on top of this, for James O'Brien to individually impugn Sangita as the one who is to blame for people speculating on this, when he already knows, because it would presumably be in his contract himself, some kind of NDA over the terms of their agreement if he were to leave the station himself, is so marvelously disingenuous. And especially since that he himself has been somebody who has had loads of accusations levied at him for being anti-Semitic personally for his growing criticism of Israel too. You'd think that it would give him at least some pause for thought over the relationship between the media and the narrative over the conflict between Israel and Gaza, that he might want to stop and think about the accusation that he makes towards the audience and the people who speculated over this sacking, and indeed Sangita's response herself, given what we know about her NDA and given what we've seen in terms of the response to his own coverage of the conflict. So broadly, a pretty poor showing from James, and I think I think he should apologise to Sangita about the way in which he's tried to impugn her specifically, when again she does not have any power to speak her mind on this issue.
I think a very fair appraisal. And people in the comments saying we should employ Sangita Myska. I'd love to get her in at Novara. Someone else saying we should employ Gary Lineker. I'm not sure we can afford Gary Lineker, but it would be great to try and get Sangita on as a co-host one day.